All right, welcome everyone to our Resource YYC Lunch and Learn. Today we have one of our lovely members, Carla, presenting. So I hope you all can get a lot of useful information from our Science to Action presentation today. And well, if you don't know, Resource YYC is a co-working community for professionals. We've got dedicated desks, office spaces, boardrooms, virtual office options. So if you're ever in need, come check us out. Over to you, Carla.
Thanks. Thanks everybody for joining. And it's just really nice to see a lot of familiar names. So hi everybody, Tracy, Jeff, Sierra and Kayla are here. This is fantastic. So if you guys like, I prefer to run this as like really interactive. There's Owen, hey. So I'm going to be asking questions. Feel free to stop at any time and ask questions, and we'll try to get through a bunch of stuff. There we go.
I'll help monitor the chat. So if anybody needs to add a question in there, feel free.
Thanks. And just to confirm, we're looking at the territorial acknowledgement right now. I'm moving the slides, okay?
Nope, the screen sharing turned off.
Well, that's what I figured. All right.
God, I hope I can get to say that one day. I don't buy cars.
There we go. How's that? Okay. So I'd just like to start with an acknowledgement of the territories that we share. So right now I'm in Calgary, and so in the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and truth, I'd like to honor and acknowledge Mohkinstsis. This is the traditional Treaty 7 territory, the name for Calgary. And I'd also like to acknowledge the territory and oral practices of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani, as well as the Yahe, Nakota, and Tsuut'ina nations. And also acknowledge that this is the territory is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3, and is within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. I'd just like to acknowledge all nations, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, who live, work, and play in this land. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that Endeavour Scientific does and some of the work that I do. And I work quite a bit with Indigenous communities and in the area of knowledge translation. And I want to talk a little bit about why knowledge translation is important and what it is. And I'm going to start with probably one of the stories that really got me involved in thinking about what is evidence, how is evidence considered, and how can we use evidence to make decisions. So I'm going to start with this paper. Is the title of it is obscure and it doesn't seem that contentious. So this is ileolymphoid nodular hypoplasia, non-specific colitis, and pervasive developmental disorder in children. It's from 1998 and it's a retracted paper. And can anybody guess the really contentious issue that this particular scientific paper set off? Yeah, Graham.
Is this the vaccination one?
Yeah, this is Andrew Wakefield's 1998 paper. And all the paper said basically was that kids who have autism tend to have associated GI issues that go along with it. And this was not really anything like hugely new. But what happened afterwards is that he actually gave a press conference a couple of days later that said, you know, this is what's happening. By the way, parents, if you're concerned, we think that kids are getting autism from the MMR vaccine. This is the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. And it's one of the 3 childhood vaccines that it's given in a course of 3 amongst a bunch of childhood vaccines. And he says, if you're concerned about it, I think that you should give them a different vaccine that's just measles by itself. And of course, it set up a whole firestorm of controversy. Oh my God, vaccines are causing autism. But what he didn't say at that press conference is that he actually owned shares in a company that made the single dose vaccine. And he was not going to make any money off of it when jurisdictions were buying this triple dose vaccine. And so you had a very clear conflict of interest. He also ended up losing his medical license over some work and experimentation that he was doing with kids with autism that was not ethical. But despite this, he became and still is a well-known name in the anti-vaccination movement. And in fact, the fallout from this is that measles, which was when I started my training was on the road to becoming one of the next the infectious diseases that was going to be eradicated. It's now become, again, a problem, and it pops up amongst kids. And so you can see that there's been measles outbreaks throughout the Western world, and they tend to be associated in communities where parents are not vaccinating. So I really wanted to know why is this happening? And so in the what now 20 years, almost 15 years since Andrew Wakefield published this paper, there's actually been quite a bit of scientific work that's showing you actually there is no link between autism and the triple dose vaccine. There's no link with autism and vaccines of any sort. And yet vaccine hesitancy remains a really big issue. Of course, we won't get into how this remains an issue with COVID, but it's a similar sort of dynamic at play. So the question is this sort of issue around the science that should be informing decision-making isn't making it to the decision makers? Is this an issue just for vaccines? No, it isn't. So climate change is obviously, a very important issue. A lot of science, very contentious, but there's the same sort of dynamic at play where there is hesitancy around that information, and there is a dialogue that is outside of the world of science about whether climate change is true or not. And so what I'm showing here is this is actually a picture of a billboard that was just outside of the Calgary airport. And so this Friends of Science organization has a website, publishes a lot of things about why climate change isn't real and you shouldn't worry about it. And as you can imagine, there's not a lot scientific about it. It's not just climate change, it's not just vaccines, it's also evolution. And so this is a picture from a zoo in California. It's actually just outside of Palm Springs. And I took my kids there and they had a great time, and it's all about dinosaurs and stuff. But then as you go amongst the dinosaurs, there's also like some statues of people with the dinosaurs. And then you go in the dinosaurs and there's some placards about how evolution isn't real and humans and dinosaurs used to live next to each other. So there's a lot of controversy that comes up, and these are examples of where science isn't making into the discourse. Closer to home, what I'm showing here, this is an example of an oil sands mining. My site, most of my work is in the oil sands region, and everything I do is about what information is out there, how do we make it useful to decision makers, and what are the decision makers' needs, whether those decision makers are the government or whether they're Indigenous communities. Fracking is another issue. We've done some workshops down here in Southern Alberta about what is the science telling us about fracking, because it's a contentious issue. And what I'm finding is when you bring people together and start talking about what are the concerns and really breaking down the concerns, and then start talking about what is the evidence for that. And you can walk people through how to think about scientific evidence, how to find it. And it doesn't always solve the issue, but it brings people to a common place where they can start talking about those issues and start talking about it from an evidence-based way. And so now what we're doing is, instead of having, two diametrically opposed camps, there is a way through talking about the evidence that you can bring people together to have those conversations. In the absence of that, what we find is a way of manipulating evidence for personal gain. And I have this picture up completely purposefully. So this is, of course, Dr. Oz. Is Dr. Oz's headshot. Can anybody guess what this picture on this side here is, where Dr. Oz is speaking? Where is he speaking and what is he speaking about? Any takers?
Was that when he went to court over something?
Kind of, yeah. So this is
Senate?
when he was testifying to Congress in 2014. So Congress was doing an investigation into basically diet pills and diet mania. And there was a Senate subcommittee on consumer protection. And what I want to talk about here is there's kind of like the shotgun approach to evidence. And so what you'll see a lot, especially in like healthcare and alternative health, is somebody saying there's these studies that show that this worked, and it's a cherry picking approach. So it's just cherry picking the evidence that supports your particular point of view, and then using that, and usually for a profit motive. And one of the reasons that humans are so good about this, and one of the reasons that science is important, is that we come to issues with our own sense of biases. And it's human nature. Humans are really good at finding patterns, at finding coincidences and attaching meaning to them. And from an evolutionary perspective, we had to be like that, right? So it makes sense if you're a caveman or woman and you notice that every time there's growling in the distance, that means that a bear is coming to get you. But in today's world where there's so much information, that propensity to attach meaning to patterns is actually not a good thing. So this particular picture I really like. This is from a citizen science website called Galaxy Zoo. And what happened was the Hubble Space Telescope was taking, you know, billions of pictures of galaxies. That's an exaggeration, but lots. And what they found was they couldn't write pattern recognition software that could classify galaxies as quickly and as reliably as humans could. So for example, even though this is an incomplete picture of a galaxy, can you tell me, is this a spiral galaxy or is this a bar or elliptical galaxy? So elliptical galaxy just looks like a blob and a spiral galaxy looks like the Milky Way. So just from this picture, can you tell whether it's elliptical or a spiral?
Probably a spiral.
Yeah, exactly. It's a spiral galaxy. Even harder, can you tell which direction it's turning? Is it going clockwise or counterclockwise?
Clockwise. If from this direction.
Oh, I never thought of that. Can't ask this question on Zoom. We'll assume Ron's right. From your direction, it's going clockwise. The point is, there is no pattern recognition software that can do that reliably. And so what Galaxy Zoo did was you could sign up for it, train yourself on classifying galaxies in about 2 minutes. And then when you have downtime, just look at galaxies that no one else in the world has seen and classify them. It was a really, really great project. But the interesting thing to me was that the reason this works is because humans are so good at finding patterns. And that can work both for us and against us. And what science is a way of really just asking people to be more rigorous about their assumptions. And so if we think that something is true, then science is the process of going through and gathering evidence to really test that assumption about whether something is true. And the really interesting thing about this is that that means that science is not authoritative and it's not, you know, pronouncements from on high, but that these are skills that anybody can learn to become a more sophisticated and knowledgeable and confident consumer of scientific information. So I'm just going to finish this section with a really funny story. So there's something called high-rise syndrome in cats. And basically in big cities, cats are known to fall out of really big buildings. And one thing vets noticed is that, wait a minute, cats get more injuries, right? The higher up they fall from. You would expect that until they hit about 3 or 4 floors. And then all of a sudden, the number of injuries that a cat gets actually starts to decline until like you get to like lots of floors. And so they're like, well, that's interesting. But if you compare this to humans, humans get more injuries as they fall from higher floors. So what are cats doing that means that they get fewer injuries? And so they did a bunch of experiments, and this is awful, but I actually found it online. They did a bunch of experiments where they take a cat and drop the cat from different positions to see how it would turn itself in air, land on its feet. They thought maybe cats hit terminal velocity at 3 floors and have more time to right themselves. And like a lot of hypotheses, like a lot of investigation went into why this was true. But there's one crucial thing that they missed when they're collecting this data. And I'll give you a hint. The data for the number of injuries that cats get comes from vet clinics. And the data from the number of injuries that humans get comes from hospitals. So what's the one thing you think that vet clinics are missing that a hospital would catch?
The dead ones?
The dead ones. Exactly. They weren't counting the dead cats, right? Because if your cat falls from 20 floors and it's a dead cat, you're not going to pay $150 to the vet to tell you that it's dead. So there's not going to be a record of it. So this one paper set off a small firestorm. We could say small, a whole bunch of investigation and people dropping cats to try to figure it out when no one actually sat there and thought, did anybody count the dead cats? And so this is an example of why really all we're doing as scientists is just trying to examine assumptions. So that's great. That's really interesting, Carla. What does that have to do for me? So it turns out that for businesses, for municipalities, for governments, making decisions is basically everything that you do. And so what I do is help decision makers access information and know how to think about it and how to use it. So everything that Endeavour does is in this area of environmental monitoring and land use planning. So you're making land-based decisions, especially for Indigenous communities. These two areas are really important. How do we find out what information a community needs? How do we get it? And then how do we move that to decision making? And then part of that is also the government relations part of it. So if we have this information, I work with communities to work with the government on how do we move this information to decision making. And all of this hinges on the field of knowledge translation, which is actually a thing. There's a whole area of work on how do we move all this information into decision making. So I'll talk a little bit first about the government relations part of the work that we do. So most of the work that Endeavour does is here in Alberta, working in the areas of land use planning and environmental monitoring. There's also always regulatory development ongoing, and so we'll work with clients on reviewing proposed regulations, giving critical reviews with those, and then also establishing a government relations pathway to allow communities and stakeholders to interact with the government. And why is this important? Because it turns out, and this happens all of the time, that really knowing how to answer a question really relies on understanding the context of that question. So I want to give you an example, which is the hot air ballooner. So man is in a hot air balloon and he's all of a sudden enveloped by clouds and starting to panic. I don't know where I am. And there's a break in the clouds. And so he descends through the break in the clouds and he sees one person out in the middle of a field, featureless field, middle of nowhere. And he says to the man, where am I? I'm totally lost. And the man on the ground shouts back, you're at 45 degrees, 25 minutes and 29 seconds north. You're about 75 degrees, 42 minutes and 20 seconds west. And I'm standing at 100 meters above sea level, which means you're probably 150 meters above sea level. And so the man in the balloon replies, oh my God, you have to be a scientist. I ask you a simple question and you give me way more information that I can possibly use, and I'm still lost. And the man on the ground calls back and says, oh, of course, you are a policy analyst. You come out of nowhere with your questions. I give you the most accurate and precise question that I answer that I possibly can. You're still lost and you're blaming me. So it's a super funny joke, and it's funny because it's absolutely true. And I've seen it a million times. And so what we will do is work with the technical people. And if you bring a technical person into a meeting, they're going to want to talk about every single little detail of this technical issue and why it's important. And no, you're saying that wrong, Carla. It's not this, it's actually this. And the nuances matter. And yeah, I totally get it. I totally get it. But you're trying to talk to the government and they don't get a thing and they don't care. And you're going to be dismissed. And so how do you distill that into an important message? Make sure that the decision maker gets it and make sure that the decision maker has access to the information that they need to make the right decision. So that is the active part of knowledge translation. And as it turns out that knowledge translation is actually a really defined thing, as I mentioned. So this is a definition from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. And the reason that I'm showing it, it was actually the field of medicine that recognize that this is an issue. So why is it an issue? Because billions of dollars annually are spent on research. It takes roughly 15 years to get research into recommended policy. This is a scary thing. As of around the 2000s, when this field started, only 30 to 50% of people in the United States were getting recommended care. 30 to 40% of patients were not getting treatments of proven effectiveness. And 20 to 30% of patients received acute care that was not needed or that could be potentially harmful. And why is this? Part of it is because there is, the field of medicine is changing rapidly, and the mechanisms for doctors to learn those changes haven't always been there. And this is not just an issue for medicine. How does this play out in Alberta? So for example, in the area where I work, which is, in the resource extraction fields, we find that organizations that aren't keeping on top of things really do carry a lot of risk. So they may be reacting to news articles that are coming out that, of new studies or, issues that are coming out in the news that they're not aware of. They may have very poor stakeholder engagement. And so we see this all of the time. People who are charged with doing the stakeholder engagement show up to meetings not ready to talk about really detailed issues. They may be slow to react to regulatory changes, which is very dangerous. And then there's the health and safety aspects as well, that there could be increase in industrial accidents because of not keeping on top of changes in, behavioral science and regulation. What I see a lot is a lot of inefficiencies. So with poor knowledge translation, if you have varying degrees of access to information within an organization, that results in the same people within an organization doing different things. That varying levels of understanding can lead to mixed messages. And I've seen whole meetings or whole workshops go sideways because of a misstated assumption about some evidence right at the very beginning. And it leads to a lot of mixed messages and conflict that don't need to be there. And then finally, important details can be missed due to disciplinary silos. So you can have one half of the organization advocating for something and the other half advocating for something completely different because they're not accessing the same pool of information. So again, this risk mitigation, for some examples of where this becomes important: municipal drinking water. There's a lot of research ongoing right now onto what are some of the compounds that are entering freshwater resources, such as microplastics or pharmaceuticals. So how do we treat and manage that? Treatment techniques are changing all of the time, and there's a risk, as we've seen for other, for some municipalities who are not keeping on top of both changing conditions and the status of their infrastructure. It can lead to health consequences in the population. Environmental management in the area where I work, and then of course climate change adaptation and resiliency for municipalities is huge. This is going to become an area that is really important, not just for municipalities, but also the insurance industry as our globe changes. For businesses that are involved in any aspect of resource extraction, there's advances in technology, innovation that change very, very quickly, and this results in a very different competitive landscape. And something that's interesting, when I used to work in vaccine design, I noticed that for the people who are on top of the literature, we knew where the patents were going, right? We can tell what research groups are chasing what questions and what they're likely to be patenting. And that sort of information in a competitive landscape is really crucial. So my definition, what is knowledge translation? It's the practice of the effective translation of technical information into the public or policy spheres. So I'll give you an example. Yeah, sorry, Rose.
So there's just a comment in the chat from Graham. He says, reading journals takes time, enjoyable, but how do you access and scan before finding the article?
I'm getting there, Graham. Super good question. And I'm going to talk about I'm surprised you think that reading journals is enjoyable. It's not my favorite thing. but there's even, you know, if you do have all the time in the world, this is still a problem. And we'll come to that. So basically there's two branches of the knowledge translation offerings that we can do. And one is getting the knowledge end user involved in the research before you start. And that's a really good way of ensuring that the knowledge that you're generating actually has some use, right? So just like the guy in the field, right, who's sitting there and really carefully calibrating where he is, that might be really interesting to the guy in the field. But for the guy in the balloon who's making the decisions, totally useless. And I see this all the time. Scientists get super excited about whatever science they want to go and do, and that's fantastic. But it doesn't always meet the needs of the decision makers. So I'll give you an example here. In this case, the decision makers was the community of Fort McKay. And Indigenous communities have a lot of concerns about, especially in the oil sands region, about the potential for traditional resources to be contaminated. And so the work that we wanted to do was to go and test some of these resources. But you have to be very careful about the ethics of doing work involving Indigenous communities. And part of the risk is, and what has unfortunately happened quite a bit in the past, scientists will go into a community and say, cool, let's go sample some pine martens and some beavers and see what the toxicological load is. Come back with a bunch of numbers and say, your mercury load is this. This is the guideline. This is what we're getting out of grocery stores. Thanks for your time, and leave. And that's not necessarily empowering, right? You aren't finding out what the community needs to know in order to make an informed decision, and then giving them the resources to answer that. And that can have ethical consequences. So there was an example of a research group was doing work on mercury contamination in the north. And they came back to the community and they said that we're finding mercury in breast milk, and left. And months later, the public health community or nursing station found a lot of babies who were underweight and undernourished. And it took them a while to figure out. And it was because of this research study that the mothers were terrified about the quality of their breast milk. And so we're feeding kids milk or creamer or anything else in a place where they couldn't get formula. So that is an example of how, without being really careful of engaging the community early, can lead to health consequences. So what's a better way of doing this? This is a knowledge translation pathway and just a schematic, right? So define who your partners are, define how they're going to be engaged, define what everybody's role is, decide what are your main messages or what are your main questions you're trying to answer, develop a strategy to answer that, go ahead and do it. And then here's the really important part, evaluate the impact. Has what you've done actually improved the ability for somebody to make a decision? So that's one way. Back to Graham's question. Okay, let's say that we're not developing our own science. Let's say instead we want to find out what's going on in the world of toxicology and industrial health. So what these graphs show, each one of these show the number of publications per year for a particular topic. So environmental, social, and governance, toxicology, and industrial health. This here is actually climate change. This one's interesting. This is COVID. You see nothing. No one ever heard of COVID until 2020. But the point is, these can be tens of thousands of papers per year. So I can show you how to access these papers and how to read them and how to interpret them, but there's still the issue of volume of the amount of reading. I can't keep up with the reading in my areas. And it's a lot of work. So how do we deal with that? And this is another thing that we can do, which is literature tracking. So again, this all has to start from the knowledge translation paradigm. So you're the decision maker, you're the organization. What do you need to know? Where are you getting that information? Where could we get the information? And find out a bit more about the knowledge user profile. What is the education level of the knowledge user? How much technical detail do they want? What are their aims? What are their concerns that they're trying to mitigate by tracking the literature. And once we understand that, we can design a briefing service that meets those needs. What we can then do is set up basically a search process so that we can have machine learning monitoring the literature for you. And the reason that this is important is actually when I came through my training, I remember being sent to the library by a professor with a list of papers and saying, go and photocopy this. That was in the mid-90s. That was in the age when there was maybe a couple hundred papers per year. But now when there's, tens of thousands on a particular area, not only is that impossible, but it becomes impossible to even track everything that's out there. And through the AI approach, they're finding that you can actually more thoroughly search the literature space and make sure that you're not missing anything. And then we can have staff scientists who can critically review this literature for its impact, rigor, and gaps. So there aren't a lot of organizations out there that can afford to have a staff scientist. But what I found is that early career scientists especially are already doing this work for scientific and project leads. And so we can have them work for you. And this will be somebody who will not really just track the literature for you, but do a critical review and be able to work with you to understand its impact, its rigor, what are some of the gaps, and how does this change your knowledge. From that, this goes to a client portal where we can set up a briefing bank, periodic updates, or critical reviews as needed. And then again, we have to evaluate how effective this is, right? So there'll be ongoing engagement with the organization. And as the organization becomes more empowered, you may find that your information needs change. And we have to be, alive and nimble to that. Donna, thank you. Aside from plain language information, have you come across any other best practices or knowledge translation strategies for regulars, government involved in environmental management? Excellent question. So the University of Toronto actually offers a professional certificate in knowledge translation, and that is generally focused more on patient outreach, but there has been some work on working with regulators and decision makers. And there are a number of different models. And so by model, I mean, it's identifying who identifying who the end user is, what their information needs are, and how you achieve those. And then there's different tools. So some tools that I've found that are really effective in large organizations that are having internal struggles with information flow is establishing a community of practice and making sure that leadership can support that community of practice. So it really depends on what the question is. And if the issue is regulatory change, that's a different problem set. And you might find there that the strategy could be something, as simple as briefing or critical review provided to the regulator. But this is where I think Alberta is going, and what would be really great is having the regulator involved in designing studies from the outset that give them the information in real time that they need. And so, for example, this is the idea behind the Alberta Land Stewardship Act and all of the land use frameworks, and also oil sands monitoring. That's the idea. And that's called integrated knowledge translation, where you have the knowledge end user involved in the design of the study. So just to wrap up, essentially what we're trying to do at Endeavour is move from the world where we have the bullhorn approach to information, what we get where everybody is just inundated with information is pushed out from the knowledge maker, to something where that information can then be used to support relationship building, to support learning, to support decision making. And this is all done by really working with the client or the decision maker, building those relationships, determining their needs, working through that translation, and really doing that in a rigorous way. One thing that we really want to avoid is we're not here to help clients find the information to make their case. We're here to help clients find the information to make strong decisions. And that's a subtle but really important difference. So I think that's it for my yammering. Any questions? Jeff.
Hi, Carla.
Hey,
Thanks.
Jeff.
Good talk.
Thanks.
Quick question. I see on a lot of research proposals a section about knowledge transfer. How does that differ from knowledge translation? Or are they the same? Are they interchangeable? Is one better than the other?
From my perspective, they're the same. So I've heard knowledge translation, knowledge mobilization, knowledge translation, really all, because it's, especially in the medical side, very much in vogue, or at least it was when I was there. I find that the terms change quite a bit with really subtle differences, but from my perspective, it's really all the same thing.
Thank you.
Thanks. Graham.
A loaded question here for you, but really around as you inform regulators or decision makers, how do you handle the fact that often policy gets made regardless if there's enough information? And the switch from knowledge translation to lobbying and going beyond the decision maker to the community of which that decision maker runs around, and even to the point where you're, in practical terms, making sure the local constituency president is as smart as the deputy minister in practical terms. So in your experience, how is it, has got to be more than pushing a wet rope in getting the information where it needs to get to in your line of work?
Yeah, that's part of the government relations aspect of this as well. So yeah, policy is like sausage. Nobody wants to know how it's actually made, right? Like it's not pretty, and we all know that, right? But there is, you're right. Just I've never ever once said, look, here's the evidence, make this decision, right? Because to be fair, policy decision making is more than just it, you know, the scientific evidence is part of it, but it's also the economics, and it's also the politics, and it's also the law. And those things are important. So you're absolutely right. If you want to be affecting change, the evidence is part of it, but it can't be all, right? And an effective government relations campaign is also about building the relationships with the regulator, finding out what their needs are. I will say lobbying is separate, right? It is different. In my experience, lobbying and advocacy make the space for the discussion. They don't determine the discussion. That might be idealistic, but.
Thank you.
And Carla, this Isaac, I will add that in some cases, Graham, there will never be the evidence to make a policy decision.
Yeah.
I mean, if you take COVID as an example, if we were to wait for the vaccines to prove that they're effective, I think the number of people who died would have tripled. So we can't always assume that we need the evidence before we set the policy. You can set a policy, and then you can collect the evidence, and then you can refine your policy.
That is entirely true, and a really, really good point. And the other aspect on this is not just your knowledge, but also your risk profile, right? So what was really interesting about decision making around COVID is that, and I had so many arguments with my sister about this, because she was like, this particular decision is bullshit. Why are these people getting access and I'm not? And right, so I get it, right? Frustrating. But the fact is, for public health decisions really come down to numbers. It's all the epidemiology. So even in the case of early COVID, I spent way more time than I am proud of playing with numbers about what does it mean if this infection rate goes up, goes down, the case fatality rate goes up, goes down. But that is what the decision making is based around. And what I think that people don't necessarily get all the time is that even in the case of where you do have information, there is uncertainty associated with that. So part of learning how to interpret evidence also becomes understanding that no scientist is ever going to tell you something is 100% certain. So that means that as a decision maker, you have to understand uncertainties and risk, and what can the evidence tell you about what those uncertainties and risks are. But what I would like to see more in Alberta this is all true, but I would still argue that in Alberta, I call it the land of the unevaluated pilot experiment. Like, I mean, this province is full of policy decisions that somebody meant to measure whether it's working or not, but then they kind of forgot and never got around to it, right? So that is a missing link.
Correct. Sometimes the policies are set with the assumption that they're going to be measuring the effectiveness, and then that's where the policy loop or the cycle falls apart. Because in a perfect world, if you set up a policy, it's supposed to be a loop. Plan, do, check, and then adjust. And if that is missing, then something's not right.
Yeah, I agree. I think Ron, and then I'll go to the chat.
Yeah. Sure. Hey, great presentation, actually. Pretty thought-provoking on some of it. So, hey, I'm curious, storytelling is like one of the best ways to communicate. But by definition, it's experience-based. But it's still one of the best ways to bring across even evidence-based in the right. In fact, if it's done right, it actually makes, it's almost like the galaxy picture. You look at it once and you've captured it, right?
Yeah.
So have you, in your experience, have you had to, do you have any good examples of where you've had to take real evidence base and actually get someone to tell the story about it without losing, because that is the risk, right? You lose the details and then it gets muddled. But do you have any experiences where you've actually used storytelling to actually bring across the evidence?
That is such a great question. The truth is, no, I don't have any good examples of it, but there is a whole branch of science communications about specifically this, because what scientists are trained to do is to say, this is my hypothesis, this is how I did it, this is what the evidence suggests, and this is what I think might be going on, and it's a crap story, right? And if even for just say there's one paper, one breakthrough, and you turn that on its head, and you said, here's what the evidence suggests, here's how we got here, that becomes more of a story. And you're right, studies have shown that sticks better and it makes for better communication. But I have had a very difficult time finding scientists who do that well. And the reason is we're not trained to, and we're actually trained to be very, very humble, right? And very careful and always talk about the uncertainties. And that
Well, it's a reputational issue too, right? So, so is that a reason for collaboration with non-scientists in the process?
100%. Yep. And a good technical writer or a good technical communicator is, I think, really undervalued. But if you want that evidence to be part of decision making, then it's crucial.
Yeah. Thanks.
And then I just see that Donna had the world's hardest question in the chat, which is, what is knowledge? Donna, that's a hard one. And I think it really.
Sorry, that was a mistake.
Oh.
Don't answer it. It's going to take forever.
But I think the point that I was trying to make with, what was it? This slide, right? I think that we can all say that there's a lot of data, there's a lot of knowledge out there. It certainly isn't wisdom. And where that breakdown between knowledge and wisdom and empowerment is it's going to be different for different decision makers.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right. I mean,
Don't let her off the hook, Donna. Don't let her off the hook. Make her answer it.
There's also a bit of a longer version of that question just above.
Oh, yes, I answered that though. There is, so the University of Toronto has some great resources on knowledge translation tactics. And so what I have is actually a set of, you can almost play it like a card game, right? So like, here's your issue, here's your tactic, here's your player. And some of the tactics are things like a community of practice. So this is where you have, say if you're in an organization and you have all of the health and safety people, make sure that they have a chance to get together quarterly and talk about challenges, new evidence, these sorts of things. That's a community practice and you're supporting them. You can have a champion. So a champion might be one person within the organization who's there to build enthusiasm for what you're trying to do and to kind of bring people to it. That is another tactic. integrated knowledge translation, which is my favorite, right? Design the study around the decision maker. That's a tactic. So there's a whole bunch of tactics, and you're right, plain language communication is just one part of that. Did I answer, Donna?
Thank you.
Okay. And Tracy, hi. Oh, you're on mute.
There we go. Hi, good presentation, really useful. As always find your stuff really helpful. I know at the beginning you talked about your, I know you work a lot with Indigenous communities, and I do as well. One of the models that I've found really useful is Tango's model of knowledge weaving. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but in their model, they talk about, yes, the importance of mobilizing information and translating information, but then there's this process of negotiating between different knowledge systems. So science and science communication is very important, but then there's Indigenous science and how that's communicated, but then it's how those knowledge systems come together. And I think that's probably a totally different presentation that you could do. But I was just wondering if you had any experience or anything that you could share around that process of negotiating, or I know Reg Crowshoe calls it validating, cross-validating knowledge systems, and how that fits in the knowledge mobilization translation system.
That is, it's funny, Tracy, because I was talking to Rose when we were setting this up, and I'm like, should I talk about this or should I talk about this? And so I decided not to talk about this because it's really, you're right, it's a whole nother conversation, and I don't know. I mean, the toxicology study was really interesting because that was an example where the questions that the researcher wanted to ask and the questions that the community wanted to ask were slightly different. So it wasn't even so much about negotiation between the outcomes, it was negotiation between the aims. And everywhere that I've been involved so far has been working with the community to really clearly define those questions. Because I find that that's the hardest part. With that said, I have had very few examples where the two knowledge systems actually conflict, right? And I find the question is more about, for me, the question is more on the empowerment side, that working with a community for how do you want to answer your question, the automatic answer doesn't have to be science. We should get Ave to do one of these. The one that she did for oil sands monitoring for the ICMAC stuff was just great.
Okay.
And then Owen, the hierarchy of specificity. I don't know what that means.
Well, sure you do. That was your story about the
was.
guy in the balloon. The guy in the balloon wanted to know, like, you're an hour west of Denver. But the scientist was so specific as to be unintelligible.
Yeah.
And I think that's also the point you were also just talking about. A fact is a fact, but there's a hierarchy of specificity. I don't need to know this. But the danger is, well, there's mercury in the breast milk, but then you have to drill down to yes, but don't starve your children. Yeah. Right. And I think that's probably an area, at least on the layman's side of things, where the eyes start to glaze over. It's like, are we in trouble or not? Is that a bear, or is that someone's tummy growling? We don't need to know the mechanisms of a growl. Should we start running? Right. Yeah. And that I've just sort of noticed that there's and that this is an oversimplification, but for the layman, they want I want meat and a bun, and the scientists want to give you the whole Megillah, right? And because there's also they like to talk about the stuff that they've worked hard on, right? No, it's all this stuff too.
You just want to give them a chew toy and send them off to the corner and say,
yeah, exactly.
But back to Ron's story, right? To the scientist, all those details is the good story. To everybody else, it really isn't. But when it comes to the interesting thing too, there's not just two things. When it comes to informing somebody about risks, it's more than just giving somebody the numbers, right? There's psychology involved. And so one of the reasons that the anti-vaccination movement has legs is because a sin of omission is easier psychologically than a sin of commission, right? So yeah, so it is easier for us to accept the risks, no matter what the like magnitude of that risk is, if it means just ignoring the issue and hoping it will go away, right? Whereas giving someone a shot when they're healthy is a sin of commission, and that is harder. And the second thing, the reason I asked about the hierarchy of specificity is that there's also a hierarchy of evidence, right? And so there's, you know, the gold standard of evidence is actually a systematic review, which is a review of a whole bunch of randomized control trials, which is the next one up. And then there's the case study, and then, you know, so on and so forth. That's been really well defined on the medical side, not as well as on the environmental side, I don't think. Isaac.
But yeah, it is Isaac again. So I think sometimes we seem to get a little confused about the role of the scientists, but the role of those who actually do the communication. And if you've been trained as a scientist who sits and think abstract, get things done, got papers written. I mean, as Carla, you have the slide here. There are a lot of papers out there that have useful information. But if you take a cross-section of the academics, the researchers who are currently doing research, how many of them do have that ability to translate the information in such a way that it can be used? So, you know, we can't blame the scientists.
No.
I think that there has to be, you know, like you said, have somebody who can actually take the information, synthesize it, and then use it to help others. I mean, for myself, I used to be a scientist, but I moved into working as a public servant. And actually, when I take a paper, I know what I'm looking for. When I read, I ask myself, what is this information telling me? What can it be used to solve the problem that I face on each day? And so, again, it's we are blessed with having a lot of scientists around, and I think we can take advantage of the wealth of information and use it in a way to help solve some of the problems. So yeah, I know sometimes we get so antsy about the scientists and how they are not able to translate information, but I don't think we should be giving them a hack. I think we have the, yeah.
That is totally fair. Point taken. I completely agree. I only like to make fun of scientists because I am one, but and I've seen myself do really stupid things that I think are super interesting to only me. But the other thing is too, is that especially as I came through my training, you were trained very much to replace an academic scientist, right? You're not trained to do anything else. And in fact, even current academics aren't, they don't get any credit for public communications. They don't get any credit for learning how to do this well. They get credit for publishing lots of papers, and that's it. So it's not just, certainly the issue is not with a scientist, I agree with you, but I do think that there's some institutional issues that are keeping us from using this information well. Hey, Jeff.
Sorry, it's an interesting point Isaac brings up, the idea of academic research versus applied research. There, you see a lot of academic research in that, hey, this is really cool, I'm going to go and do this, versus somebody needs something done, so I'm going to figure out how to get that done. Is that a different approach then?
Yes, 100% it is. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree, Jeff. I mean, when you look at the spectrum of research that has to be done, there is room for innovation. The cutting edge research, things, you can't use them today, but it helps inform things into the future where, those innovations can lead to, advancement in technology. And you're correct. There is one for let's get it done. And I'll use the oil sands as an example. I mean, Carla, you bring it up. I mean, we need to resolve some issues around tailings. We need to resolve some issues around salinity and things like that. How do you take a research from a bench scale to a field scale to help inform those things? So yeah, Jeff, I agree with you, and you've been involved in some of those research yourself, and so there's room for that. Anyway, that's my comment.
But yeah, like the value of the research then, right? I mean, where the value from an academic perspective is on academic research. The value towards applied research seems not to be as high or as valued.
I think things are changing. If you look at the way things are funded these days, even in Alberta here, I mean, there's a lot of room for funding research that actually can be applied. And you know, I know, I mean, graduate students have to graduate. You can't have a PhD students doing applied research and they can't graduate. But so how do we incorporate elements of cutting edge research and apply it for graduate students to graduate? And there's always a balance, you know, that you have to look at.
Yeah, but it doesn't necessarily mean that all that research has to be done by academics too, right? So if you take the examples of oil sands monitoring, it's been 10 years and I forget how many papers, but in the hundreds, probably close to 1,000, I don't know, lots. What has changed in terms of regulation? Nothing, right? And so like another example for everybody else, there's been a lot of studies looking at, say, the accumulation of compound X in a bullseye around the mineable region. So that's really interesting, right? And we have, you know, sometimes doing that year after year. Is it still there? Is it still there? Is it still there? That becomes academically interesting, but it is not interesting from a management perspective because no one has told me where is it coming from? How do you mitigate it? That sort of stuff. And that gap, I think, is a big problem in Alberta. And we're spending a lot of money to answer questions that aren't impacting management. And so maybe relying on academic researchers to do all that, there's definitely a role, but it doesn't have to be the only people doing
it. That's true. If we get around the idea that it's not academic research and therefore it's not authentic, you know, sometimes we seem to get caught in that where there is, you know, applied research, good information that can be used, but the reluctance to implement them sometimes can be a barrier.
Yeah, that's a good point. Denise.
Hi, Carla. There was something in your presentation that really resonated. I was hoping you had time to elaborate on it a bit, which is your point around the shift that has been occurring for some time regarding the pushing of information out versus a knowledge exchange that supports strong decisions, which, if I captured it right, you almost phrased as the relationship. I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit more. There was some references you made to like engagements, people showing up and not being prepared for technical discussions. So in the face of knowledge exchange, various models that define science from different worldviews, how do you see engagement unfolding between regulators, policymakers, and the public at large?
That's really hard. That's a hard question. So the best advice that I got when we started working in government relations is that government relations is all about relationships, because you're trying to solve difficult problems and you can't understand the context of those problems without building the relationship and taking the time. And certainly in my work with Indigenous communities, that's even more true. Right? Relationships are huge. And so I can speak in the context of, you know, the government Indigenous relationship, that it requires people who are willing to make friends and be there for the long haul and build relationships and be able to talk about, you know, what do you need to know and how can I support you in that? I think the short answer is it's going to take more time and more people, and it's expensive and it takes time. Right. But what we see a lot is there's a lot of reliance from the government and the regulator on intermediary organizations. So like NGOs representing a certain interest or land owner groups representing interests. And so that's how I know Graham. right? We both represent certain interests on you know, outreach attempts from the government. And it can get you a small way, but it certainly doesn't get you the whole way. So it's not a very good answer, other than it takes more time. And I really, really do believe that working with stakeholders, and I've done this, where we've brought together people, let's talk about fracking and water quality. I work for an ENGO, let's bring some industry people in, let's bring in the ENGO sector and talk about fracking and water quality and some landowners. That could be a very explosive meeting. That could be really, really difficult. But if you start by saying, okay, here's how you think about the evidence. Here's some evidence that I've collected. I'm going to get you into groups, and your job is to sit there and talk about that graph. What is the graph telling you? What do you think about the experimental design? What do you think about what is unknown? That breaks down a lot of positional barriers, and it gets people at least to the place where they're talking about something common, which is the evidence that everybody can see. And you can all agree that there needs to be more research and there's things we don't know, but that is an agreement on principle, at least on one thing.
Thanks so much.
All right, I think that's about all the time we have for today. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Carla, for the great presentation. We had an amazing discussion, and I think everyone managed to pull a little bit of information out of it. So thanks, you.
Everybody.
All right, hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks, everyone.